Association was in the northern part of Ivory Coast, and then in about 2002, one morning we heard the building jolted, and we discovered that we were under attack, and soon we were surrounded by rebel forces, the Force Nouvelle of the Ivory Coast. And it took us a while to get out of there, and then the Institute had to basically pull up stakes and move to Benin eventually, and is just now returned to the Ivory Coast. But we had many good times and wonderful and productive times, as well as challenging times at the West Africa Rice Development Association, now Africa Rice. Following that, he served for 2 years as vice president of IFAD, and then was elected the president of IFAD. To be president of IFAD, you have to be elected by a multinational voting. I suppose it's probably votes just about like UN votes, with a vote for each country that's a part of the United Nations. So Dr. Nwanze was elected by the people of the world, and served in one 4-year term, and then was elected for a second 4-year term. It gives me enormous pleasure and honor to invite Dr. Nwanze to speak to us today. Thanks a lot for joining us, Kanayo.
For that introduction, I think you've done me more favor than I deserve, but I will keep it. First of all, well, distinguished professors, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, let me say it's a great pleasure to be back here in College Station and at Texas A&M. And I think Ed Price has basically given you the history of my association with Texas A&M and with the Department of Entomology. I feel a particular connection, as he said, to this campus, to Texas A&M, because as he said, I spent 4 years at another land-grant university, Kansas State University, way back in the 70s. And that's certainly formed the foundation of what my life turned out to be later. One of the most important lessons I learned when I was at Kansas State, was that researchers have to look beyond their test tubes. Researchers know the local physical environment, and to understand that local community in which they work. I've seen the wisdom of that approach in my years as a field scientist, as a research manager, and also my current role within the United Nations. But that's not what I want to talk to you about today. For those of you who are not familiar with my institute and who may not have had the opportunity of going through one of our brochures, IFAD is a specialized agency of the United Nations, but it's the only international financing institution within the UN system that is dedicated wholly to financing rural development. I put the emphasis on rural development. We work currently in about 96 countries worldwide, across Africa, Latin America and the Caribbean, Asia and the Pacific, and of course North Africa, Near East and Eastern Europe. We support development programs and projects that are managed by governments themselves, and these could range from agriculture, mostly agriculture, and also sometimes it will deal with rural health. We provide rural financing for communities, particularly in areas where There are no banking systems. We also help in the development of organizations, basic community organizations, and basically anything that has to do with rural development. Our programs currently at about total ongoing portfolio is pretty close to $7 billion. And this is about the average that we carry. Annual funds available for disbursement to countries will be about $1 billion every year. And funding comes from our member states. We are supported by member states' grant contributions. And of course, other funding sources like loan reflows for countries who borrow, as well as our own capital investment returns. But let me go into the topic of today's conversation, current and future challenges for sustainable food and nutrition security. I hope that many of the students here today are, of course, familiar with Norman Borlaug. That would be an understatement. A plant biologist, whom we know as the father of the Green Revolution. He's described as a man who saved 1 billion lives because of his work. Norman Borlaug, way back in 1970, said, and I quote, "It is sad that it's a sad fact that on this planet, at this late date, there are still two worlds, the privileged world and the forgotten world." That was in 1970. Almost half a decade ago, that statement still remains valid. It has not changed. Now, if we are really sincere about our ambition to rid the world of hunger and poverty, then we must endeavor to reach this forgotten and visible world. I do not intend to spend this afternoon to provide you the magic solution to this problem. I am not going to be talking about the science of entomology and the science of agriculture. But I'm going to be talking about the underlying factors that are making it difficult for us to achieve sustainable livelihoods, food security, and nutrition security. They are not the usual themes or areas that you may expect me to talk about, but I believe from my own experience that working in as many countries as we are and having traveled across continents, visiting with communities in rural areas, sitting down and breaking fast with them, or sharing a drink, sitting on the ground, on benches, and slapping our shoulders after a couple of drinks and people talking to you. Then you realize that we probably sometimes are not in touch with reality on the ground. We use the expression the forgotten world, the invisible world, because that's exactly what it is. Norman Borlaug said this, as I said, almost 50 years ago, to be exact, 45 years ago. Now, who are these people? Who are they? They are the children, the women, and the men who live in rural areas of the developing world. Now, they account for almost 40% of the world's population, about 3 billion, but they actually represent 75% of the world's poorest and hungriest. Now, if we are really serious about eliminating poverty and hunger, then we must focus on these people. Now, why does IFAD focus mostly on agriculture? These populations of rural people, their major source of livelihoods is agriculture. Why does IFAD only focus on smallholder agriculture, small-scale agriculture? Because the form of agriculture practiced by rural populations is basically small holdings, less than 2 hectares of farmland, 1 or 2 heads of cattle maybe, a goat, a sheep, a little pond for fishing. But paradoxically, and the irony of all of this, is that they produce over 75, sometimes 80% of the food that is consumed in the developing world. Now, you can just imagine that. How come is it that those who produce the food that feeds the majority of the developing world are the same ones who are poor, who go to bed hungry? This tells us that there's something wrong here. They live in areas that are oftentimes forest areas, undeveloped, no roads, bush paths, mountains, valleys, forests, or even islands. They're oftentimes, not always, far away from the political and media centers. And because they are unseen, they are invisible, we forget them until there is a crisis. Let me take a couple of examples as recent as last year, the Ebola crisis. This terrible disease is not new. It first appeared in the 70s in the Congo DRC, Democratic Republic of the Congo. But it was ignored, it was neglected, until Ebola moved from the rural areas to capital cities of the 3 West African countries, Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia. Then it traveled across deserts and oceans and got to Europe and got to North America. That was the only time that we showed a collective response, a global response. From the 70s onwards, we had outbreaks. We had an outbreak as recently as 2012 in Uganda. It hardly hit the headlines. So until about 5,000 people had died. Total, as of today, of victims from Ebola is 11,000 plus. As long as these populations were invisible, they died and they were buried. Nobody talks about them. Let me be a little bit specific. Ebola was able to progress unchecked for months because of lack of infrastructure, lack of medical facilities, lack of investment in early detection, treatment, and vaccination. And of course, because of poor education, which led to widespread ignorance about how the disease was spread. So why was Ebola neglected for decades? As I said, because most of those affected were the invisible and the forgotten world. We have a crisis that is currently problematic, particularly in Europe, parts of the Americas as well. Let's take the case of migration. I'm sure you're familiar with migration here in Texas. It's an ongoing problem. It's been there for decades. It's been there for days and days after days. Now, what causes people to migrate? We have the Peace Center. We have a lot of information about it. People migrate because of conflict. Yes, certainly conflict is one of them, but also hunger, poverty, inequality, poor governance, persistent indignity, and lack of opportunities. Now, very few people know that the Syrian crisis, the crisis in Tunisia, the crisis in Libya, that these countries experienced extreme droughts in 2010, 2011, particularly in Tunisia. And you had massive migration of rural populations from their farms to the capital city, and they swarmed the capital cities. Egypt, the largest importer of wheat, the largest eaters of bread. The price of bread rose by 60% in 4 months in 2011. For those of you who are familiar with the crisis in Egypt, you know what happened that year. So let's connect the dots. Extreme weather conditions, severe droughts and crop failure, massive internal migration, civil unrest, and destabilization of the political system. But as long as these were happening between and within boundaries, they remained far away from the visible world. But these are the conditions that have forced millions of rural people to leave their homes year after year, century after century. But migration only hits the international headlines when there is a disaster. Today we have a disaster in Europe. Millions of people have crossed the Mediterranean from Africa, from the Middle East. And this has been happening for years, for decades. But until they started to drown in large numbers, until they suffocated in freezer trucks in Austria. Now, just think about it. Which parent in their right mind will put their child on a boat across an ocean unknown when the seas become safer than land? When you have to make that choice, it's safer for your child to be on the seas unknown rather than to be on land. We humans as a species are remarkably short-sighted. We delay taking action until a problem becomes a crisis, than things that could easily have been solved. We've forgotten the old adage, prevention is better than cure. But the same can be said of hunger, because we continue to ignore the realities of today until people begin to die from famine. From my perspective, the fact that we have reduced the number of hungry people from 1.9 billion in 1990 to just under 800 million today is not progress. Because for you and I, as long as one child dies any day because of hunger or nutrition-related problems, our job is not done. Because everyone has a right to life. So for us at IFAD, it is not just a tragedy that we still have 795 million people who go to bed hungry every night. It is a travesty. It is a travesty because we already grow enough food for every child, for every woman, for every man on this planet, so that they can eat adequately and nutritiously. And their lives are blighted forever. And why is that so? Because of our collective greed, our complacency and inaction. It's a travesty because this can be prevented. The cost of inaction is incredibly large. And that is where I believe the problem lies. I would like to impress upon you that our best hope of achieving global food security and nutrition is to focus on the invisible world. Let me explain. I want to emphasize again. Poor people of the world, the majority of them live in developing countries. They live in rural areas of the world. You are actually fighting an enemy. What do? You go where the enemy lives. Because no matter the amount of investment into urbanization, and we do not take the rural areas along with us, they will still remain a blight to our human race. And they will continue to have this migration from the rural to the urban areas. The year 2015 will go on record as the year where we had the most important of meetings. We had in Addis Ababa this conference on financing for development. Just last month, the United Nations and Sustainable Development Goals, now known as Agenda 2030, whereby in the next 15 years we shall eliminate hunger and poverty completely. And in December, we'll meet in Paris on what is called COP21 to agree on a climate deal. But I believe that the time has come for us to go beyond meetings and beyond words and beyond conferences, declarations, promises, and commitments. We do not have 15 years. It's time for action. It's time for action because we know what works and we know what does not work. All it calls is sustained, committed leadership. We must be held accountable for delivering tangible and verifiable results and not make commitments that we never fulfill. Agenda 2030, which was endorsed, as I said, just last month by the United Nations, will ensure that no one on this planet goes hungry. It's called the Zero Hunger Campaign. That is the question. My answer is, why not? For those of you who are familiar with the Millennium Development Goals, MDG 1 challenged the world and the international community to reduce hunger and poverty by half by 2015. We achieved it 5 years earlier. By 2010, FAO, the World Bank, declared that we had reduced the number of hungry people by 50%. Now that we have all of this technology with us, why should we not be able to do the same in 15 years so that we go to zero? But as I said, meeting this agenda requires a strong commitment to transforming the rural areas of developing countries. Transformation. We want to go from rural development to rural transformation. Why transformation? Because you can develop and yet not grow. You can have development without growth. You just vegetate. We'll talk about transformation, where the rural space has all the incentives for the young people to make a life and to make a living in rural towns. So the rural space becomes transformed into rural towns with energy supply. So they have internet, paved roads, social services, schools, banking systems, and incentives for those who produce the food that feed the world. That is why it takes more than just meetings, because we know what to do. We have the technology, we have the intellect, we have the people of the world who can do it. It's been done elsewhere. Within the last 35 years, take China, take Brazil, take Vietnam, and see what they have done. But it takes political leadership at the highest level of government to do it. Besides that, As I said, there's a nexus between the urban and the rural area. So that those living in cities should want to see a transformation in rural space. The rural area is where food is grown. Agriculture is done in rural areas, not in cities and urban capitals. The rural areas also provide us with clean air and water that flows through rural space or rural areas into cities. We need very strong rural economies that offer decent jobs, dignified living conditions, so that the world's growing population is not forced to pack itself into cities. What happens, as I said, young people, when they migrate, because there are no opportunities in the rural areas, they go to cities and they lose the cohesion of their community. They're exposed to rhetoric and extremism. And we know what happens from after that. Too many parts of the world's rural space today is destitute. But over the years, places as far-flung as Bangladesh, Bolivia, Burundi, and Burkina Faso, I have seen time and time again how rural transformation can change the life of communities. And it doesn't take much. Let me share with you some things that I've come to understand. I know here in Texas everything is big, but think small a little bit. Because 80% of all farmland that is cultivated today is less than 2 hectares. 80% of all farmland in the world is less than 2 hectares. They are small farms. The big ones are in Texas. And there are 500 million households that cultivate this farmland. And as I said to you, for the developing world, they produce about 80% of the food that is consumed. Now, these are the lands that we have to support. It is easy to say that, but if these populations are so poor, why don't we just grow the food somewhere else, like in Texas, and then ship it out? Well, you know what that happens, what that brings? It brings dependency. It's not development at all. It's not even transformation. So we have to create the conditions that make it such that they make their business of farming profitable and remove the constraints that keep them in bondage, as we say. Developing the potential for small farms is good economics because farming production systems have few economics of scale. In China, 200,000 small farms cultivate only 10% of the developing world's agricultural land. Only 10%. But they are responsible for producing 20% of the total production. Vietnam, rice production, within 25 years after the Vietnam War, over 60% of all rice farms are less than 2 hectares and they are grown by small farmers. And Vietnam is the largest rice exporter, mostly by the work of small farms. So small farms are important in these communities. They help create vibrant economies in rural areas. They create jobs, not only to feed people, they also empower communities. So as I said, there's an economic flow between the urban and the rural area once the rural area is vibrant and economically viable. So that by transforming rural areas into economic hubs of activity, we make them more attractive for young people. In too many parts of the world, the young people are unemployed. They are unemployed and underemployed. And the rates are becoming more unacceptable. They may be better educated, but the prospects of employment for them is very bleak. Now, imagine a situation where you have 600 million young people today in the world, projected in the next decade. They're going to be vying for only 200 million jobs. In Africa today, there are 200 million young people between the ages of 14 and 25. 35% unemployed. That is 70 million young people roaming the streets without jobs. You can imagine what that could be in another decade from now. So we need to create jobs that are attractive. And farming is very attractive. But it has to go beyond the woman with a baby on her back, a hoe in her hand, tilling the soil. That image does not encourage anybody to go up to become a farmer, I can assure you. But there's modern technology today that makes farming a real business, creating opportunities. It has to be attractive to young people. Who is going to produce the food for 9.6 billion people by 2050? We are currently 7.4 or 7.5, I believe, rising. Every year the number increases. Who's going to produce the food? For those of you who have traveled to South Asia and Africa, I mean Sub-Saharan Africa, the populations are between 50 and 60 years old. In 10 to 15 years, maximum by 2030, they will no longer be there. Who is going to farm the land? And how are they going to do it? Ladies and gentlemen, in my career, first as a scientist and today leading an international organization, part of the UN system, there are a few things I have learned, and let me see if I can share them with you. And maybe that will generate some questions in the next session. And maybe also that way I can learn a few things from you. The first one, we must take advantage of everything that science has to offer. And when I say science, and this is where there is a difference, because oftentimes we will say science, we think of the biological sciences and the physical sciences. I also mean the softer sciences, the social sciences, the dynamics of policies, of human behavior, their social norms and traditions and their beliefs. These are as important as a Nobel Prize scientific achievement. So to the younger generation in this audience, you need to always know the social context of the community where you want to work. You have to know the people. They may not be as educated as you are, but they know the terrain better. And for those who just parachute for a few weeks to a few months and give advice and they parachute out again, it doesn't help. Working with them, learning the social context in which they operate and the environment helps you make success and impact. Development also needs to respond to the needs of communities we serve, rather than the scientists need to see their products or their research published. Of course, as a scientist, I know the feeling to want to have my studies published in a journal. But you also have to know whether the technology or the products you are giving to the farmer is the right one. For example, you say farmers are not applying fertilizer. If they can apply fertilizer, they will double their yield. Yes. But do they have the money to buy it? Or even if they applied fertilizer and they double their yield, do they have a road to transport the surplus to the market? Do they have storage facilities to store it? So it's not just increasing the yield of a variety that matters. It's in the context in which that crop is being produced. I've also learned that high technology or advances in research and development will have the desired impact in people's lives, will not have the desired impact in people's lives unless the special aspects of the community are adequately addressed. We must understand the context in which they operate at a particular time. I'd like to give this example from Ethiopia. It was a project I visited last September, last year. One of these project sites was highly participatory, and they had women and men working together. But because of the dynamics of this group, they had formed themselves into an association, and they were beginning to evolve into cooperatives. And this helped them to operate, because working as a cooperative or as an association, they were able to build some dynamism, ability to negotiate directly with buyers, ability to influence policies that were made by the municipal authority, an ability to have collective supply of produce and to negotiate good price. As a result, of course, their yields, of course, increased better. They were able to form themselves into a water users association for irrigation. So you had an organizational structure. And this exists everywhere, whether here in Texas or elsewhere in Europe. But in these developing countries, there's a need for an organizational structure for farmers to be able to access inputs and the rest of them. We have to learn these things. It's not just the technology itself alone. Let me quickly move to a second factor that I believe I call these success factors. Now, this is something that some of you may have experienced, and I'm sure that Professor Ed Price has experienced this himself. Development is something that people do for themselves. We do not do development for people. People must develop themselves. Our business is to provide them with the tools to catalyze it, to influence it, to create the environment. But they themselves must develop. Otherwise, there's no movement. So development is not something that we do for people, but it is something people do for themselves. And too often we measure the results of our efforts, of our inputs, in terms of number of projects, in terms of number of countries, in terms of how many dollars that we have disbursed. And sometimes we say 500,000 households have benefited from this project. What benefit? How do we measure that benefit? So our work should show evidence of childhood malnutrition, improvements in school attendance, reduced stunting in children, improvements in women's entitlement to land, and by the health of the ecosystems. As I said, merely raising yields will not solve hunger, but in particular also nutrition. I mean, you can eat potatoes 3 times a day. Hash browns for breakfast, French fries for lunch, mashed potatoes for dinner. That's all. It's just potato. You're not going to grow. Let me use something that my West African friends here will understand. You can eat gari for breakfast, eba for lunch, and fufu for dinner. Your stomach will be full, but you will not grow tall. So helping poor farmers to diversify what they do, what they grow. Because we say, for rural populations, you are what you eat, because what you grow is what you eat. As we say, charity begins at home. By diversifying into backyard gardens, growing vegetables between your cornfields and so on, makes a big difference, particularly for young lactating mothers. So also it is important for farmers to be connected to markets. And with IT today, that can be done in and so we have to be sure that the tools for self-development reach the hands of rural women. I have to emphasize this. the rural woman is very key for success in developing any developing country. I know it in Latin America, it is so in Asia, it is so in Africa. A country that does not recognize the role of rural women in development will never develop. Unfortunately, they are the most underprivileged. In Africa, we have a saying, when you invest in a man, you invest in an individual. When you invest in a woman, you invest in a community. Because every dollar a woman earns, a rural woman, I'm not speaking about city women, I don't know them. I know rural women. She's going to be sure that her children are well fed, that they go to school, they have their school uniform, and they're healthy. It takes about fixing his bicycle, or buying a new one, or putting a new roof on the house. And in a number of cases, he takes another wife. We know it. Women make up 43% of the agricultural workforce. We need to invest in them. Why? Because they are the primary caretakers in rural households. And as I said, when she earns $1 extra, she's most likely going to invest it in her family. But too often in rural societies, women are without rights. They have no access to credit without permission from their husbands. They have no rights to the land they farm. They have little authority in their homes or in their communities. And this results in higher rates of poverty and malnutrition. You can ask me the question, so what is IFAD going to do? I can describe dozens of projects that entail women empowerment, access to financial services, helping to build women's association so that they can actually have the power to be able to speak. And we've seen the difference. And that is why we put a lot of emphasis in building the capacity of farmer groups and organizations. Because when smallholders join together, they have greater purchasing power. They have greater bargaining power in the marketplace. We also know that they have collective knowledge about flooding, about the situation, about the soil types, and about crops and livestock. And when they work together in groups, they make better progress and they contribute to community development. Let me move on very quickly to my third factor. Yes, donors and institutions in development agencies have a role to play. But transformation requires governments to be responsible, that governments themselves must invest in their own people. With transparent governance and reliable institutions, and they must enforce existing regulations and taxes, and to make sure the revenues go into public funds, not into people's pockets. Why do I say this? Because frankly speaking, if we are talking about food security, national development, and you have governments that do not think about their people, there is no way that country is going to develop. Pumping money into that country is no use because you're just encouraging corruption. Let me take Africa, for example. A lot of people say, well, Africa has about 60%, some say 70% of all uncultivated agricultural land is in Africa. So we can expand agriculture. You hear all this argument about land grab. Stupid government officials who do not understand that those 60% or more should be considered as a strategic reserve that should not be touched. We don't have to touch any of those 70% of the global available agricultural land that is supposed to be in Africa. Why do I say that? Because current farming systems in Africa are so underproductive. You all know it, for those of you who have worked in Africa or South Asia, they are 40 to 60% of the productivity level. Corn yields are less than 1 ton per hectare. You can easily get 5 tons on rain-fed agriculture. How many kilograms of fertilizer do they apply in sub-Saharan Africa? 13 kilograms of fertilizers per hectare is what farmers are applying. Compare that to 100 kilograms in South Asia. 10 to 13 kilograms, like a drop of fertilizer in 1 square meter of land. What can that give to you? Irrigation. Very little land is irrigated in Africa, about 5%, most of it in Egypt and South Africa. The rest is dryland agriculture. In South Asia, in Asia, 41%. So what I'm saying here, and then of course, as Ed Price knows, improved varieties are a rarity. It's traditional varieties of crops that they still grow. So you look at existing agricultural systems, farmers are still using old varieties, no input. So why do you want to exploit your 60% of your available land when your existing land systems are underperforming? I believe the issue here is productivity. And the tools are there. We know they're there. But you need governments that are responsible, that make fertilizer available to small producers, not to the elites group. The former Minister for Agriculture in my country, Nigeria, who is now the president of the African Development Bank, it took him 9 months of being Minister for Agriculture to be able to do away with the practice that had lasted for how many years, 20 or more years since independence, actually 30 more years, 30 or more years, I think he said, to be able to change that and make fertilizer available to farmers. The Ministry of Agriculture used to be a fertilizer distributing company by itself. It took him 9 months to do it because he knew what to do and he had the support of his leadership. So what I'm saying here, existing approaches to increase agricultural productivity exist, and we have to capitalize on them. I'll move very quickly to my fourth and final factor. And that is for the young ones in this room. Dream big, but do not be afraid to think small. Sometimes the greatest discoveries have been based on small things. Innovation is the key. But innovations do not always result from big ideas. Sometimes there are the small ideas that you take and you scale them up, and they begin to transform communities. Let me tell you about one simple one. I talked about fertilizer earlier on. Farmers hardly use fertilizer. In the Sahel of West Africa, I mean, you put fertilizer by traditional approaches. You just basically you procrastinate, and that's all it is. But farmers can hardly afford it. But look at this technique. Instead of applying fertilizer the traditional way, some young students, I believe it was from the previous topsoils or project of Texas A&M, of USAID, and they used bottle cap, just a bottle cap, a Coke bottle, a Sprite bottle, and you take the fertilizer in the bottle cap and you just put it at the foot of the plants. It becomes available to the plants, right there. And that way you solve the problem. Now, so bottle cap technology is a technology to solve an old problem. Simple technology. But that's what we're talking about. Dream big, but think small. And don't ignore the small possibilities that exist when you are working in rural communities. So even illiterate farmers can use it. Or take the case of mobile money. Those of you who are familiar with M-Pesa in Eastern Africa. Imagine farmers or rural populations who never even knew about a land telephone line, never saw a telephone wire cross their street. Today can use handheld mobile phone to buy inputs, an e-wallet system, to do banking, to transfer money, to receive money. So these are the kind of things that I believe we must be looking at. Research certainly has a role to play in food security for today and for the future. Yeah, of course. I visited some labs today, and I was happy to say that simple techniques like marker-assisted selection, marker-assisted breeding, tissue culture, these techniques have been able to give us things like Nerica rice in West Africa, quality protein maize by CIMIT, vitamin E-rich potatoes by SIP in Peru, and they work. So we have to recognize that technology, particularly biotechnology, is a tool. It's not an end in itself. There is a place for GMO technology when the conditions are so severe that no other technique can resolve the problem. Then you use biotechnology. But everything that is genetic is not biotechnology. And we have to understand that. So we have to exploit all possible avenues to achieve successful food security. And one last item I'd like to bring within the context of my last proposal, of my last factor, success factor, is digital technology. It's linked with what I just said before. We are in the 21st century, and we don't expect a woman, as I said, with a baby on her back, with a hoe, to be able to transform agriculture in Africa or in South Asia. Mobile technology has given us the e-wallet system, mobile banking, etc. But digital technology can speed up the education of small farmers, make connections possible, transfer information at incredible speed, build virtual communities, and revolutionize farm organizations. It's not rocket science, but I think this is where youth have a role to play. Because farmers of my generation are not going to be able to pick up as fast as these technologies are moving. So I see huge opportunities for a younger population to modernize agriculture production systems, particularly along the value chain. So we do not end up season after season having piles and piles of fresh fruits, fresh food on roadsides, rotting, and prices just dropping because we have no simple transformation facilities. So I believe that when we look at the challenges that are facing developing countries, it's not the absence of technology. It's how we organize ourselves to make sure that these technologies are available in the hands of small producers. And if you ask me, who is going to fund Agenda 2030? It's a huge agenda. It calls for trillions and trillions of dollars. I will say, developing countries have the responsibility to provide the funding for themselves. Why do I say so? Overseas Development Assistance, ODA, by donor countries is only $150 billion, roughly $135 billion a year. Domestic resources by developing countries today is put at $7 trillion. So what is $150 billion compared to $7 trillion? So what is the problem? The problem is very simple. Corruption, bad governance, poor tax administration and redistribution, and illicit financial outflows. My continent alone loses $50 billion a year in illicit financial outflows from the continent. Yet, we make pretty close to $950 billion annually from the extractive industries. There is no reason why we cannot finance our own development. But as I said, it takes good leadership. And this is an area where the development community can also help by asking for accountability. Accountability for those who give money and accountabilities for those who receive money. So overseas development assistance can be a catalyst that will encourage governments to invest more and more in their own development. I may have sounded a little bit very pessimistic when you look at it, But I was in New York when we adopted the Sustainable Development Goals, Agenda 2030. And what I saw there for the first time in years was a commitment by heads of state and government that this time around we cannot afford to fail. Why? Because the world is one world. There's no invisible world. There's no forgettable people. They are part of the human race. We either float together or we sink together. And I believe that by working together and committing to meet Agenda 2030, not only will we assure of sustainable food and nutrition security, but we can create a world where crisis is averted. Agriculture not only feeds people, it creates jobs, it empowers communities. When people are well fed, particularly children, they stay in school. And the community becomes more cohesive. And you have stability in communities, you have political stability and global peace. But I believe that the younger generation here today and elsewhere have a role to play. Tomorrow is in your hands. The future is yours. My future is in the past. But I hope that what I've said and shared with you today will encourage you to think in the same directions as I have done. Thank you very much.
Yes, can you take a question or two? Yes.
It's not on, but I can talk
Just,
about it.
yeah, talk loud.
Dr. Nwanze, I would just like to start off by thanking you for coming to A&M and speaking to us. It's really an honor being able to hear this amazing speech from you. So you say that one of the keys to ending hunger is turning these rural communities into hubs for economic activity. So speaking to someone who will be working in a rural community in a developing nation for not just weeks or months, but for a couple of years, where would you say is a good starting point? Because you say that, if they don't have roads, if there's no market, how do you get to that point? Where would you say is a good starting point?
Come work at IFAD. Well, basically, I'm serious. But you just cannot go out there and say you want to go and do. You want to be associated with one of the organizations that work in rural communities, in rural space. There are several international NGOs that do this. There's Oxfam, there's Save the Children. No, I'm not sure it's Save the Children. There's the Gates Foundation. Right today, there are several UN agencies. My institution, for example, as I said, works only in rural areas, and we work with a lot of other institutions. And what is interesting there is that it doesn't take much in terms of investment. You'll be amazed what $100, for example, can do to a women's group. Just providing them with that money, that seed money, what they can do with it. It's too many times we think that, it's going to take $1 million to bring about change. It's the way you work with it. Community-based development or community-driven development is the fastest way to, first of all, win the confidence of the people that you work with. And you want to do that in the context of existing institutions. So I would say, you just cannot, one individual cannot change the world. So you want to be associated with an NGO or an institution that IFAD offers opportunities to young graduates, particularly with master's degree, to do an internship of 6 months, either at headquarters or in one of our country offices. I know there's also staff that use. Tom also, I think in Washington you take in interns, a different kind of interns, and they can do up to 3 months. That's a way to begin. Do an internship, so that at least you get to be exposed on how these institutions work. But you see, what gives me the biggest pleasure in this job is like when I travel out and I meet communities to see how projects, investments are doing to people's lives. And you'll be amazed, how by providing simple micro irrigation techniques to women that are growing vegetables, and they can grow it all year round, and how much money that brings. Putting a paved road up on the Moroccan hills of the province of El House saves women 4 hours of going to fetch water. So these little things contribute a lot to changing rural population, changing their lifestyles, and businesses begin to grow. Women, all of a sudden, in the case of El House, I saw that in 2013. There's 4 hours just to go and fetch water. Then you put a road that saves them. They take 30 minutes because they can take the camel with them rather than walking. They have extra time. They eventually formed a women's association processing nuts and fruits. Now, that association grew to the point where they could not take care of their children. So somebody helped them to establish a creche for the children to go to school. So we saw the creche. 4 to 2 years to 7 years, children going to creche. Their mothers are now running a business in the Women's Association. It's amazing. And this all happened within 5 years. So these things can happen. We know it. So there are several, I'm sure Ed Price can give you a lead on where to start.
Thank you.
Tell you what, we've actually run a pretty long time. We have refreshments out front, and if you'd like to stick around and ask some more questions, if that's okay with you, Kanayo, we'll go outside and have some questions there. I will add one thing, however. This last year was very, very inspiring. World Food Prize this year. A young man received the Borlaug Prize for innovation. There are two prizes now given. One to an accomplished scientist, and one to a young innovator. And the young innovator this year is named Eric Polson, Polhson, or Pohlson. He started the 1 Acre Fund. You can Google it. You may have heard of 1 Acre Fund. Mm-hmm. This guy was a Peace Corps volunteer. Instead of coming home after that, he said, I can make a difference. And he stuck around. He got a partner who was more in finance. He's more in agricultural technology. And the two of them started 1 Acre Fund. It now has 100. They've impacted about 600,000 farmers from what I hear. And it's just a remarkable story of innovation. And it was started with a couple of people. And now we have Aggies working for them. Actually, Howdy Farm that started out here by Grimes, Brady Grimes. That was started by Brady Grimes. Brady Grimes went from Howdy Farm to Tanzania to 1 Acre Fund. And now he's working with the Buffett Foundation in Rwanda. So there's a path there. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your presentation, everybody. Thanks to all of you for coming. And we'll step outside and we'll have some refreshments and more discussions with Kanayo.